A single distress beacon crackled over the hyperwave, carrying the sound of a 7-year-old taking her last breath. It was ignored by the Valeri Senate, filed away as acceptable collateral. What the galaxy didn't understand was that humanity hadn't lost the war 3 centuries ago. They had just gone to sleep. And out in the cold dark, beneath the ice of dead moons and the crusts of forgotten asteroids, old engines began to warm. Garrett's knuckles were bleeding again, though he hadn't noticed when it started. He was too focused on the rhythmic, scraping turn of the torque wrench against a stripped coupling. The maintenance bay of Station Kalen 9 smelled like an open grave filled with batteries. A sharp, metallic tang of ozone, mixed with the damp, sour rot of failing life support scrubbers. Garrett liked the smell. It was honest. It told you exactly how close to suffocating you were on any given cycle. He leaned back on his heels, wiping a smear of black, sulfur-stinking grease across the thigh of his coveralls. His knees popped. He was 46, but in standard gravity, his joints felt 60. Across the bay, the battered public terminal flickered to life. Usually, it just spat out cargo manifests or endless scrolling advertisements for synthesized nutrient pastes. Today, the screen bled a harsh, acidic yellow, the universal broadcast color for the Valeri hegemony's internal security division. Garrett didn't look up. He didn't care. He spat a wad of gritty saliva onto the grated deck and reached for a laser cutter. "Attention, transit workers," the terminal droned. The voice was synthesized, scrubbed of all inflection, a perfect auditory mirror of the tall, gray-skinned bureaucrats who ran this sector. A minor security breach has been rectified in Sector 4, Habitation Ring Alpha. Pest control measures were authorized and executed. Garrett thumbed the ignition on his cutter. A thin blue beam hissed into existence, throwing harsh shadows across his scarred hands. The insurgent was found harboring contraband technology near the Volari diplomatic docking seals. Lethal pacification was administered. The screen flickered, dropping from the yellow crest of the hegemony to a low-resolution security capture. The Volari loved to show their work. It kept the endangered species in line. Garrett caught the image in the periphery of his vision. He tried to look away. He really did. He was a master at looking away. It was how he had survived the last 2 decades in the slums of the Outer Rim. But he looked. The cutter slipped from his grip. It hit the deck with a heavy clatter, the safety switch engaging a second before it could burn a hole through the hull. On the screen was a pile of rags. No, not rags. An oversized patched thermal jacket, the kind that swallowed a small frame entirely. A pair of worn canvas boots stuck out from the bottom. One of the boots was missing its laces, tied instead with a length of bright blue electrical wire. Garrett's breath hitched in his throat. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of his stomach. No, the Volari enforcer on the screen, a towering, segmented figure wrapped in ceramic armor, kicked the body over with a casual, almost bored flick of its heavy boot. The face rolled toward the camera. It was Chloe. She was 9 years old. She had a gap between her front teeth and a laugh that sounded like a broken air horn. Every Tuesday cycle, she would sneak into Garrett's bay, smelling of ozone and stolen synth apples, asking him 1,000 unanswerable questions about stars she had never seen. Her skin was pale, dusted with the perpetual gray grime of the station. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the rusted ceiling of Habitation Ring Alpha. A neat, cauterized black hole marred the center of her chest. Contraband technology. Garrett felt the blood roaring in his ears. She collected scrap, shiny things, blown fuses, polished bearings. She called it her treasure. The broadcast cut back to the yellow hegemony crest. "Order is paramount," the flat voice concluded. The screen reverted to a scrolling ad for nutrient paste. Garrett didn't scream. He didn't punch the bulkhead or fall to his knees in a display of righteous, cinematic grief. He just stood there, staring at the ad. His stomach churned violently. The metallic smell of the bay suddenly became suffocating, cloying, like pennies shoved down his throat. He turned away from the terminal, took 2 steps toward his toolbox, and violently threw up onto the grated floor. He dry heaved until his ribs ached, his eyes watering, a thin string of bile hanging from his lips. He wiped his mouth with the back of his greasy hand. He was trembling. Fine, uncontrollable tremors that started in his fingers and ran all the way up into his jaw. Chloe was dead. A 9-year-old human girl, vaporized over a pocketful of junk. Garrett looked at his trembling hands. They were cowards' hands. They had spent 20 years hiding, fixing broken pipes for the very monsters who had just murdered the only thing on this station that made Garrett smile. "Damn it," he whispered. The sound was pathetic, lost instantly in the hum of the station's ventilation. "Damn it, Chloe." Garrett's quarters were no better than a closet. A narrow cot, a rusted wash basin, and a single flickering luminaire that buzzed like a dying insect. He sat on the edge of the cot, a dented flask clutched in his hands. The cheap ethanol inside tasted like engine cleaner, but it did the job. It burned a path down his throat and settled as a dull, glowing coal in his gut, chasing away the shivering cold that hadn't left him since he saw the broadcast. He took another long pull. He wanted to get blind, blackout drunk. He wanted to wake up 3 cycles from now with a splitting headache and no memory of a little girl with a blue electrical wire for a shoelace. But the alcohol wasn't working. It was only making his mind sharper, dragging old, buried memories to the surface. He rubbed the back of his neck. His fingers found the small, puckered scar at the base of his skull. The neuro port. It had been deactivated, fused shut with a localized laser burn 19 years ago when he deserted. He wasn't a hero. He was a rat who had jumped a sinking ship. When the United Earth Directorate realized the Galactic Coalition was going to exterminate them, they didn't fight a glorious final stand. They scattered. They buried their remaining assets, wiped their own nav computers, and hid in the dirt of 1,000 alien worlds. They called it the long sleep. Garrett called it giving up. He hated Earth. He hated the generals who had ordered them to hide like roaches. He had spent his whole life trying to scrub the military posture from his spine, trying to blend in with the dregs of the galaxy. He looked at the flask, then threw it across the room. It bounced off the bulkhead, spilling its pungent contents over the grating. He stood up, his breathing shallow. He paced the 3 steps across his room, then paced back. His mind was a chaotic mess of contradictions. He wanted to run. He should pack his meager tools, steal a shuttle, and head for the deep fringe. The Volary would forget about the human girl by tomorrow. To them, humans were an invasive species, tolerated only for cheap, hazardous labor. "She brought you a bruised plum last week," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. "She stole it from a merchant and gave it to you because she said you looked sad." Garrett pressed his palms against his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids wasn't empty. It was filled with Chloe's blank, dead stare. "I can't," he muttered to the empty room. "I'm just a mechanic. I don't remember the codes. It's been 20 years. The hardware is probably dead." He was making excuses, and he knew it. He walked to the far wall. It was a solid panel of riveted plasteel, covered in years of grime and illicit graffiti. He stared at it for a long time. The hum of the dying luminaire seemed to grow louder, deafening. His heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't the steady, determined beat of a soldier. It was the frantic, erratic thumping of a terrified man. He was sweating. His palms were slick. He reached out and slid his fingers under the edge of the panel. He expected it to be rusted shut, hoped it would be. But the hidden pneumatic seals, dormant for 2 decades, hissed quietly. The panel popped open, sliding to the side to reveal a small, pristine cavity. Inside, untouched by the station's grime, was a smooth black console. A single, glass-covered keyhole sat in the center, flanked by a biometric scanner. Garrett stared at it. It looked alien in this filthy room. It represented everything he had run away from: the duty, the war, the slaughter. If he touched it, there was no going back. If he woke the sleepers, the galaxy would burn. The Volari, the Kalen, the dozens of other races that had stomped humanity into the mud. They would respond with total annihilation. It would be the end of the human race. "Order is paramount," the flat, synthetic voice echoed in his head. Garrett's jaw tightened. The fear in his chest didn't recede, but it hardened into something dense and brittle. He didn't care about the human race. He didn't care about Earth. He cared that a 9-year-old girl was dead, and nobody in this godforsaken galaxy was going to mourn her but him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object he had carried for 20 years, disguised as a spark plug gauge. He twisted the end, revealing a jagged, physical key. His hand was shaking so badly, he scratched the glass plating twice before sliding the key into the slot. He placed his left hand on the biometric pad. A sharp prick pierced his palm. The console sampled his DNA. A tiny green LED flickered to life. Identity confirmed. Chief Warrant Officer Garrett Hayes. Status: sleeper. Garrett swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He leaned forward, speaking into the dusty microphone. His voice cracked. It wasn't a roar. It was a tired, broken whisper. "Protocol Lazarus." Nothing happened. For 5 agonizing seconds, Garrett stood in the silence of his cramped quarters, listening to the drip of condensation. He let out a breathless, half-hysterical laugh. Of course, it was broken. The old Earth tech had rotted away, just like everything else. He pulled his hand away from the console, feeling a sudden, crushing wave of exhaustion. Then, the deck plates shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical sensation, a deep, subsonic vibration that traveled up through the soles of his boots and rattled the marrow in his bones. The dying luminaire above him shattered, plunging the room into darkness. Garrett stumbled backward, catching himself on his cot. The vibration grew. It didn't feel like a station malfunction. It felt as though the entire superstructure of Kalen 9 was being dragged across a giant sheet of corrugated iron. Alarms began to wail, not the yellow security alerts, but the deep, oscillating red sirens of a catastrophic structural threat. He scrambled out of his quarters, out into the narrow corridor of Habitation Ring Alpha. The hallway was plunged into emergency red lighting. Panicked station dwellers, squat, multi-limbed mechanics, and towering avian merchants were pouring out of their doors, screeching and clicking in confusion. Garrett pushed through them, ignoring their frantic questions. He made his way toward the outer observation deck. He had to see. He had to know if the ghost stories were real. The observation deck was a massive vaulted room with a reinforced glass steel window looking out into the void. Usually, it offered a view of the Volari trade fleet, elegant silver needles drifting through the black. When Garrett reached the glass, a crowd had already gathered. They weren't looking at the trade fleet. They were looking past it, toward the massive dead moon that Kalin 9 orbited. Ethra 7 was a lifeless rock of ice and frozen methane. It had been surveyed 1,000 times. There was nothing there. But as Garrett pressed his hands against the cold glass, he watched the impossible happen. The surface of the moon was fracturing. Massive fissures, hundreds of miles long, tore across the pale ice. Geysers of vaporizing methane erupted into the vacuum of space, catching the distant starlight like fountains of diamonds. The station shook violently again. Someone in the crowd screamed. From the deepest fissure, a light emerged. It wasn't the clean blue plasma of Volari engines. It was an ugly, angry, blood-red flare. The raw, unrefined thrust of a thermonuclear fusion drive. The ice crust bowed upward, cracking like a delicate shell, and then shattered outward. A shape rose from the dust and debris. It was impossibly large, a brutalist slab of gray titanium and black armor plating. It had no elegant curves, no aerodynamic grace. It was a flying sledgehammer designed for one singular purpose: to break things. Along its miles-long flank, deeply etched into the metal and glowing with residual heat, was a single, stylized emblem: the orbital hawk of the United Earth Directorate. Garrett's breath fogged the glass. It wasn't just one ship. Behind the Leviathan, the moon's surface continued to erupt. Dozens of red flares ignited in the dark. Cruisers, dreadnoughts, swarms of angular fighter craft shaking off the dust of a 20-year slumber. The hidden fleet, the Volari trade vessels, sleek and delicate, scrambled their security escorts. They looked like gnats buzzing around a rising storm. On the public terminal behind the crowd, the flat synthetic voice of the station AI broke its usual calm, sounding frantic, looping its distress call. Warning: unknown signatures detected. Threat level absolute. Repeat: threat level absolute. Garrett watched as the lead Earth dreadnought turned its massive prow slowly toward the station. He felt no triumph. He felt no soaring sense of patriotism. He only felt the heavy, suffocating weight of what he had just unleashed. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cold glass. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered, the sound lost in the panicked screams of the crowd. "I brought you your fireworks." Out in the void, the human fleet armed its mass drivers, and for the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy learned what it meant to fear the dark. There is no sound in a vacuum, but a kinetic bombardment creates its own atmosphere. When the human dreadnought fired, it didn't use the polite, cauterizing beams of the Volari hegemony. It used electromagnetics to hurl a 2-ton slug of depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. The sheer displacement of energy tore a microscopic tear in the fabric of local space, emitting a localized burst of hard radiation that shorted out every non-shielded optical sensor on Kalin 9. Through the heavy glass steel of the observation deck, Garrett watched the slug hit the lead Volari cruiser. It didn't explode. It simply erased the middle third of the elegant silver needle. The kinetic transfer was so absolute, so violently immediate, that the remaining bow and stern sections crumpled inward before spinning away into the dark, trailing clouds of flash-frozen atmosphere and shattered crystalline plating. The station's artificial gravity stuttered. A low, nauseating hum vibrated through the deck plates, pitching upward until it sounded like tearing silk. The crowd in the observation hall didn't just panic, they devolved. An avian merchant next to Garrett let out a deafening, trilling shriek and bolted, its massive wings knocking Garrett backward. He hit the unyielding plasteel of a structural pillar. His shoulder popped. Pain, bright and jagged, flared down his bicep. He didn't try to stand. Standing was how you got trampled. He dropped to his hands and knees, the grated floor digging painfully into his kneecaps, and began to crawl. Above him, the emergency lighting flickered and died, replaced entirely by the chaotic, strobing flashes of the massacre outside. The human fleet wasn't engaging in a tactical skirmish. They were a swarm of starved locusts descending on a manicured garden. Angular fighters, ugly and unpainted, swarmed the remaining Volari escorts. They moved with a jerky, brutalist efficiency, dumping clouds of chaff and unleashing torrents of unguided munitions. It was a butcher's work. It was exactly what the old directorate had been designed to do. Garrett tasted copper. He had bitten his tongue when he fell. He spat a mouthful of thick, red saliva onto the floor, dragging himself forward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the maintenance access hatch at the rear of the hall. Air scrubbers wheezed violently as the station's power grid diverted everything to structural integrity fields. The air grew immediately stale, thick with the smell of voided bowels, molting feathers, and the sharp tang of raw ozone. A massive shockwave hit the station. The glass steel window, rated to withstand micrometeorite impacts and low-yield ordnance, spider-webbed with a sound like a cracking glacier. People screamed. It was a terrible, unified sound of impending suffocation. Garrett reached the maintenance hatch. His fingers, slick with his own blood and grease, slipped on the manual override wheel. He cursed, a frantic, breathless sound, wiping his hand on his uniform before grabbing the wheel again. He threw his entire weight backward. The rusted gears shrieked in protest, then gave way. He threw himself into the narrow, dark tunnel just as the first hairline fracture appeared in the observation window. He slammed the heavy hatch shut, spinning the locking wheel until it wouldn't move, then collapsed against the cold, damp bulkhead. In the pitch black of the access tunnel, he hugged his knees to his chest. He was trembling so violently his teeth chattered. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't been one in 20 years, and even then, he was just a wrench monkey patching up the ships that did the actual dying. Through the thick metal of the hatch, he heard a sickening pop, followed by the roaring, catastrophic howl of explosive decompression. The screams cut off instantly. Garrett squeezed his eyes shut in the dark. He pressed his greasy hands over his ears, trying to block out the silence that followed. "What have you done?" He had wanted to burn the Volari who pulled the trigger. He had wanted to burn the gray-skinned bureaucrats who ordered it. He hadn't meant to vent a room full of frightened merchants and mechanics into the void. But the sleepers didn't know the difference. To them, the war had never stopped. To them, the whole galaxy was the enemy. His pocket vibrated. It was a sharp, electrical sting against his thigh. He patted down his coveralls, his fingers clumsy, and pulled out his standard-issue diagnostic data pad. It wasn't displaying engine metrics. The screen was a solid, blinding white. Text began to scroll across it, rendering in the blocky, utilitarian font of the old Earth military. Lazarus actual. Command node located. Establish hardline. They were looking for him. Garrett stared at the data pad. The white light cast harsh, terrifying shadows against the cramped walls of the maintenance shaft. He didn't want to answer. If he ignored it, maybe they would assume the beacon was an automated glitch. Maybe they would do their damage and jump out of the system before the hegemony's core fleets arrived. Acknowledge Lazarus actual, or orbital bombardment protocols will initiate on local coordinates. Garrett stopped breathing. Orbital bombardment. They were going to glass Kalin 9. They were going to turn the entire station, with its 2 million indentured workers, slaves, and refugees, into a cloud of radioactive vapor. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He needed a hard line. Wireless comms were too degraded by the radiation outside, and the fleet needed biometric confirmation to stand down. He stumbled down the pitch-black tunnel, navigating by memory and the dim glow of his data pad. The air in the shaft was freezing, the life support systems clearly failing. His breath plumed in pale clouds in front of his face. He clipped his head on a low-hanging pipe, tearing the skin on his forehead. He barely felt it. Adrenaline was a cold fire in his veins. He reached a junction box, a mess of tangled fiber optics and copper wire that fed into the station's central communication spine. He dropped to his knees, prying the cover off with his bare hands, tearing a fingernail backward in his haste. He hissed through his teeth, spitting on the wound, and pulled a physical connection cable from his diagnostic pad. He jammed the connector into a universal port on the junction board. The data pad flickered. The white screen dissolved into a wall of gray, rolling static. Then, a voice crackled through the pad's tiny, tinny speaker. It didn't sound like a machine. It sounded like a man who hadn't spoken in 3 centuries. It was dry, hoarse, and thick with the groggy phlegm of cryostasis. Lazarus actual. This is Admiral Reed, commanding the UES Vengeance. A pause, filled with the crackle of interference and the distant, muffled thud of artillery. Report your status, soldier. Where is the rest of the directorate? Garrett's throat was bone dry. He swallowed hard. There is no directorate, sir. Silence stretched over the line. Heavy, suffocating. Repeat. Actual. Reed's voice came back, lower this time. Dangerous. Your signal is degraded. Where is the fleet? Where is Earth? Garrett closed his eyes. The weight of 300 years of history pressed down on his shoulders. Earth is dead, Admiral. The core worlds were glassed. We lost. The survivors scattered. You were buried to hide you from the hegemony sweeps. The static hissed. For a terrifying moment, Garrett thought the connection had dropped. Or worse, that Reed had simply decided to execute the bombardment protocol. Who am I speaking to? Reed asked. The military cadence was slipping, replaced by a brittle, ragged edge. Chief Warrant Officer Hayes, Engineering. An engineer woke the fleet, Reed noted. Why now, Hayes? After 3 centuries? Is this a counter-offensive? Did command reform? Garrett looked down at his trembling hands. The blood from his torn fingernail was dripping onto the glass of the pad. He thought of the tactical lies he could tell. He could invent a resistance. He could invent a strategic vulnerability in the hegemony. But he was too tired for lies. "No, sir," Garrett whispered. "There's no resistance. We're just rats in the walls. We fix their pipes. We mine their ore." "Then why did you trigger Protocol Lazarus?" Garrett leaned his head back against the freezing metal bulkhead. "Because they killed a little girl over a pocket full of scrap wire." The silence returned. This time, it stretched for a full minute. The station shuddered around Garrett, a violent lurch that sent dust raining down from the ceiling. He could hear the distant, muffled sound of secondary explosions tearing through the lower habitation rings. "A little girl," Reed repeated. The voice was unreadable. "She was 9, Garrett said, his voice cracking. He hated how pathetic he sounded. He hated the tears of frustration that pricked his eyes. "They shot her and left her on the deck like garbage. I couldn't just watch it anymore. I'm sorry, Admiral. I know I broke protocol. I know I've probably doomed whatever's left of us. But I wanted them to pay." Garrett waited for the court-martial. He waited for the order to glass the station. Instead, a harsh grating sound came through the speaker. It took Garrett a second to realize it was a laugh. A dry, humorless, terrifying laugh. "Doomed us, Hayes?" Reed's voice dropped to a guttural growl. "We've been dead for 300 years. We woke up with dust in our lungs, and our home turned to ash." A heavy mechanical clack echoed over the comms, like the chambering of a massive artillery shell. "You didn't break protocol, warrant officer. You gave us a target." Reed's voice sharpened, becoming pure, sharpened steel. "Upload station schematics. Highlight non-combatant sectors. The Volari command structure on that station is to be dismantled, systematically." Garrett's fingers flew across the datapad. "Uploading now. Admiral, the indentured workers, the aliens. They didn't do this." "We are butchers, Hayes, not monsters," Reed replied, cold. "Hold your position. Marines are in the tube. Let the hegemony see what crawls out of the graves they dug for us." The connection severed. Garrett slumped against the wall, the datapad sliding from his slick fingers. He had done it. He had pointed the gun. Now he just had to survive the recoil. The maintenance shaft smelled like melting plastic and terror. The emergency klaxons had finally bled out, their power lines severed by the structural buckling of Kalin 9. In their place was a far worse sound, the heavy rhythmic thud hiss of Volari pneumatic armor. The hegemony enforcers weren't fighting the fleet outside. Their cruisers were already scrap metal. The surviving garrison on the station had realized that boarding parties were imminent. Like any parasitic wasp cornered in a hive, their immediate instinct was to purge the host. They were sweeping the maintenance levels, executing any human they found to deny the invaders a foothold. Garrett was crouched behind a massive insulated coolant pipe, clutching his heavy torque wrench. It was a stupid weapon, 30 inches of solid vanadium steel. It was heavy, unbalanced for swinging, and cold enough to sap the heat from his palms. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. He forced himself to breathe through his nose, swallowing the dry, metallic taste of fear. Thud, hiss, thud, hiss. They were close, just around the bend of the access tunnel. The sweeping beam of their thermal scanners painted the far wall in a lattice of invisible infrared. Garrett squeezed his eyes shut. "Think like a rat," he told himself. "Rats don't fight wolves in the open. Rats bite the Achilles tendon from the shadows. He reached to his tool belt with his free hand. He unclipped his laser cutter, the same one he had dropped when he saw Chloe's body on the terminal. He didn't turn it on. Instead, he twisted the focusing ring, bypassing the safety limiters, and jammed a spare copper fuse into the ignition switch. He wedged the jury-rigged cutter into a narrow gap between two steam pipes, pointing it toward the corner. He didn't have to wait long. A shadow fell over the deck plates. A Volari enforcer stepped around the bend. It was massive, 7 feet of segmented ceramic composite armor, painted in the harsh yellow of internal security. Its helmet was an expressionless dome of black glass. It held a thermal pulse rifle casually at its hip. It paused. Its sensory suite must have picked up Garrett's body heat, radiating from behind the pipe. The massive rifle began to swing toward him. Garrett threw a loose bolt at the laser cutter. It was a clumsy throw. It missed the switch entirely, bouncing harmlessly off the pipe. Panic seized Garrett's chest. The enforcer stepped forward, raising its weapon. Garrett didn't think. He lunged. He kicked out from his hiding spot, his boot slamming into the jury-rigged cutter. The impact snapped the ignition switch. The bypassed battery dumped its entire payload in a fraction of a second. Instead of a thin blue cutting beam, the tool detonated in a blinding, concussive flash of superheated plasma. The explosion was entirely contained within the narrow walls of the shaft. The sound was deafening, a physical blow that shattered Garrett's left eardrum. Warm blood instantly trickled down his neck, the world pitching into a high-pitched, endless ringing. The Volari enforcer caught the brunt of the flash. Its black glass visor cracked, and it stumbled backward, its armor blackened and smoking. It fired blindly, a pulse of thermal energy ripping through the coolant pipe above Garrett's head. Freezing, toxic freon gas sprayed into the tunnel. Garrett didn't retreat. The raw animal instinct of survival overrode his trembling knees. Through the blinding smoke and the hissing chemical spray, he charged. He swung the torque wrench like a baseball bat. He aimed for the joint, the one place the ceramic armor was flexible. The heavy vanadium struck the back of the enforcer's knee. The impact sent a jarring shockwave up Garrett's arms, nearly dislocating his shoulder again. He heard a sickening crunch, wet and loud, even through the ringing in his ears. The enforcer roared, a wet, clicking sound, and collapsed onto one knee. Garrett didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He was 46 years old, exhausted, terrified, and fueled entirely by 20 years of compressed rage. He brought the wrench down again, this time aiming for the cracked visor. The alien raised an armored forearm to block. The wrench deflected, glancing off the ceramic plate and smashing into the enforcer's collarbone. The alien grabbed the handle of the wrench, its hydraulic grip crushing Garrett's fingers against the steel. Pain shot through Garrett's hand. He let go with a gasp, stumbling backward into the cloud of freezing freon. The enforcer, despite its shattered knee, leveraged itself up. It dropped its rifle, reaching for the heavy kinetic sidearm holstered at its thigh. The black glass of its visor was a spider web of fractures, but through it, Garrett could see the pale gray skin and the hateful, lidless eyes. Garrett had no weapon. His chest heaved. He looked at the alien's sidearm, then at his own empty, bleeding hands. "I'm sorry, Chloe," he thought. "I tried." Before the enforcer could clear its holster, the wall of the maintenance shaft exploded inward. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was a breach charge. A perfectly shaped square of the bulkhead blew inward, crushing the enforcer against the opposite wall. The heavy ceramic armor crunched like a beetle under a boot. Through the smoking hole stepped a nightmare. It was a human, but barely recognizable as one. It wore void combat armor that looked as though it had been forged in the Dark Ages. Matte black, scarred, brutalist plates of ablative steel. No shields, no elegant curves, just a walking tank. The Marine stepped over the twitching body of the Volari enforcer. It didn't even look down. It raised a massive, belt-fed kinetic shotgun and fired once, point blank, into the alien's helmet. The sound in the confined space was apocalyptic. Garrett fell to his knees, covering his head, coughing violently as the dust and cordite filled his lungs. The Marine lowered the weapon. Heavy magnetic boots clamped onto the deck plates as it walked toward Garrett. It stopped 2 feet away. A tactical light clicked on from its shoulder, blinding Garrett. "Chief Warrant Officer Hayes?" The voice came through an external speaker, distorted and heavily modulated. Garrett kept his head down, coughing up a wad of soot and blood. He nodded weakly. The Marine reached down, a massive armored hand gripping Garrett by the collar of his grease-stained coveralls. It hoisted him to his feet with terrifying ease. "Lazarus Actual secured," the Marine barked into its internal comms. Then, the helmet turned slightly, regarding the jury-rigged laser cutter, the ruptured coolant pipe, and the smashed remains of the enforcer. "Sloppy work, mechanic," the Marine said, the modulated voice completely devoid of humor. Garrett leaned heavily against the wall, clutching his broken fingers to his chest. The ringing in his ears was fading, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful sound of gunfire echoing through the station's corridors. The directorate had boarded. "It's been a while," Garrett wheezed, wiping the blood from his ear. The Marine didn't reply. It simply racked the pump of its kinetic shotgun, chambering another massive round. "Stay behind me. The Admiral wants the command spire taken. We need someone to pick the locks." Garrett looked at the blood on his boots. It wasn't his. He felt a cold, empty satisfaction settling into his chest. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold vacuum of the grave he had just opened. "I know the way," Garrett said. He stepped over the crushed armor of the Volari guard, following the ghost of a dead Earth into the smoke. The Marine didn't have a name, not as far as Garrett was concerned. Its armor lacked unit insignias, rank markers, or even a call sign. It was just a looming black-plated silhouette that smelled intensely of gun oil and stale sweat, moving with the terrifying, jerky efficiency of a machine. Garrett followed. He didn't have a choice. His left hand was a swollen, throbbing knot of agony, 2 fingers jutting at unnatural angles. He tucked the injured hand against his chest, clutching his greasy coveralls to keep the arm immobilized. His lungs burned. Every breath tasted of vaporized copper and the sour, undeniable stench of ruptured intestines. They stepped out of the maintenance tunnel and into the primary transit concourse of Sector 4. Garrett stopped dead, his boots sticking briefly to the deck plates. The concourse was a vast, cylindrical artery that connected the habitation rings to the command spire. 20 minutes ago, it had been a bustling thoroughfare filled with neon advertisements and the chaotic chatter of a dozen endangered species. Now, it was an abattoir. The UED boarding parties hadn't bothered with tactical precision. They had moved through the concourse like a thresher through wheat. The walls were painted with sweeping, jagged streaks of deep purple Volari blood and the paler, thinner fluids of the avian and reptilian underclasses. The air was a thick, hazy gray, choked with the smoke of deployed chaff grenades and the lingering caustic dust of pulverized plasteel. "Keep moving, mechanic," the Marine growled. The voice modulator stripped all humanity from the command. It was a statement of physics, not a request. Garrett swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He stepped over the mangled corpse of a Volari merchant. The alien's elegant, silver-threaded robes were soaked, its chest caved in by a kinetic slug that had carried enough force to shatter the bulkhead behind it. They weren't all soldiers," Garrett rasped, his voice trembling. He pointed a shaking, blood-stained finger at a cluster of bodies huddled near a smashed noodle stand. They were Kalen, short, multi-limbed mechanics, the same species Garrett had worked alongside for 2 decades. They had no weapons. They had just been in the way. The Marine didn't pause. Its heavy magnetic boots hit the grated deck with a rhythmic, unyielding clank, clank, clank. "Target identification takes time. Time costs momentum. We do not surrender momentum." Garrett stared at the faceless black helmet. He wanted to scream at the soldier, to punch the unyielding armor, to demand some shred of basic human decency. But a cold, hollow realization settled in his gut, heavier than the gravity plating. He had known this. He had known what the directorate was. They were the military that had scuttled their own colony ships to use the engines as makeshift fusion bombs. They were the men and women who had turned Earth into a radioactive wasteland rather than let the Volari take it intact. They weren't saviors. They were an extermination protocol. And Garrett had pushed the button. "Order is paramount," the dead station AI's voice echoed in his memory. The Volari maintained order with precision strikes and cold bureaucracy. Humanity countered it with absolute, indiscriminate ruin. "The central elevator is locked down," the Marine stated, breaking Garrett's spiral. They had reached the base of the command spire. The massive, reinforced blast doors sealing the transit tube were dropped, locked tight with heavy mag seals. Garrett dragged his eyes away from the carnage. He forced his brain to engage with the mechanics of the station. He was an engineer. Problems had solutions. "Mag seals," Garrett muttered, stepping up to the polished metal doors. He leaned his forehead against the cool steel, closing his eyes for a second to fight a wave of dizziness. "They're drawing power directly from the spire's localized grid. You can't blast them. The doors are meter-thick tungsten carbide. Your kinetics will just ricochet and turn us into paste." The Marine lowered the massive shotgun. "Solution. I need to bleed the power," Garrett said. He turned, scanning the smoke-filled concourse. His eyes locked on a primary junction box set high on the wall, a tangle of heavy conduit feeding directly into the elevator shaft. "There, the primary relay. If I can short the logic board, the fail-safes will trigger. The doors will drop their magnetic lock, and we can force them open manually." "Do it." Garrett walked to the wall. The junction box was 10 feet off the ground, accessible only by a narrow maintenance ladder bolted to the plasteel. He reached up with his good hand, grabbing the lowest rung. He tried to pull himself up. Fire lanced through his broken fingers as they brushed against his chest. His knees buckled, and he slipped, hitting the deck hard. He gasped, curling into a tight ball, his vision swimming with black spots. The Marine stepped over to him. It didn't offer a hand. It simply stood there, an immovable monolith of black armor. "Are you combat ineffective, actual?" the Marine asked. Garrett looked up, grinding his teeth. The pain was blinding, but the humiliation was worse. The soldier was looking at him the same way he looked at a jammed rifle. Discard. Replace. "I'm fine," Garrett spat. He forced himself up, his breathing ragged. He grabbed the ladder again, this time entirely ignoring his left arm. He hauled his dead weight up, step by agonizing step, using his legs to push, his right arm trembling under the strain. He reached the junction box. He didn't have his tools. He had lost his data pad, his wrench, his cutter. He had nothing. He looked at the thick, bundled cables feeding the mag seals. They were insulated with heavy synthetic rubber. Garrett pulled his left hand from his chest. He looked at his broken fingers. He needed a conductor. He needed something to bridge the positive and negative terminals on the logic board. He reached into the pocket of his coveralls. His fingers brushed against something thin, flexible, and covered in cheap plastic. He pulled it out. It was a length of bright blue electrical wire, the wire Chloe had used as a shoelace. He had picked it up off the deck after the Volari swept her body into the incinerator chute. Garrett stared at the wire. His thumb traced the frayed edge. The plastic casing was worn smooth, where a 9-year-old girl had tied and untied it 100 times. "Hurry, mechanic. Contacts on motion sensors," the Marine warned from below. Garrett didn't say anything. He stripped the plastic casing off the ends of the blue wire with his teeth, tasting the bitter tang of cheap polymer. He popped the latch on the junction box. The logic board inside was a complex labyrinth of glowing fiber optics and exposed copper relays. He found the primary power feeds. He took a breath, wedged his shoulder against the wall to brace himself, and jammed the bare ends of Chloe's shoelace into the high-voltage terminals. The wire vaporized instantly. A blinding arc of electricity snapped across the board, blowing the relays into a shower of white-hot sparks. Garrett was thrown backward off the ladder. He hit the deck with a bone-jarring thud, all the air rushing out of his lungs. Above him, the heavy mag seals of the elevator doors let out a deep, dying groan. The lights on the blast doors flickered from red to dead black. The Marine didn't check on Garrett. It walked to the doors, jammed its armored fingers into the central seam, and heaved. The hydraulics in the suit whined, a high-pitched scream of stressed metal. Slowly, agonizingly, the meter-thick tungsten parted. Garrett rolled onto his side, coughing violently. The smell of ozone was overpowering now. It smelled like his maintenance bay. It smelled like home. He dragged himself to his feet, ignoring the fresh blood trickling down his chin. The blue wire was gone, incinerated to dust. "Doors open," the Marine said. "Up we go." The transition was jarring. They left the elevator shaft on the uppermost level of Kalen 9. Down below, the station was a festering wound of rusted pipes, exposed wiring, and the suffocating smell of unwashed bodies. Up here, it was a different universe. The command spire was pristine. The deck plates were polished white marble, imported from a world Garrett couldn't name. The lighting was soft, warm, and indirect, designed to mimic the afternoon sun of the Volari homeworld. The air scrubbers here didn't wheeze. They hummed silently, pumping out air that smelled faintly of citrus and clean linen. It made Garrett sick to his stomach. 2 more Marines had joined them in the shaft, their black armor standing out like oil spills against the immaculate white corridors. They moved in perfect tactical synchronicity, clearing the empty halls with swift, brutal efficiency. They reached the grand double doors of the overseer's sanctum. The doors were carved from heavy, dark timber, an antique, a flex of wealth and power in a galaxy built on cheap plasteel. One of the Marines didn't bother checking the handle. It raised its shotgun and blew the lock to splinters. The other Marine kicked the doors open. Garrett stepped inside behind them. The sanctum was massive. One entire wall was a sweeping glass steel window looking out into the void. Through it, Garrett could see the graveyard of the Valari fleet. The elegant silver needles were gone, replaced by expanding clouds of debris and freezing gas. The UED dreadnoughts hung in the dark like iron leviathans, their red engines burning like angry eyes. In the center of the room, standing behind a desk of polished obsidian, was Overseer Vale. He was a tall, impossibly thin Valari, his gray skin smooth and unblemished. He wore robes of spun silver and deep crimson. Two elite guards stood flanked beside him, their yellow armor pristine, their energy rifles leveled at the door. "Hold fire!" Vial shrieked, his voice lacking the synthetic calm of the station's automated broadcasts. It was reedy, panicked, and desperate. "I am a high-tier administrator of the hegemony. You cannot execute me. This is a violation of the Galactic Accords." The lead Marine, Garrett's escort, didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared twice. The sound in the acoustically perfect room was devastating. The two guards didn't even have time to squeeze their triggers. The kinetic slugs tore through their ceramic armor like wet paper, ripping them in half and painting the immaculate white wall behind them in a fan of deep purple gore. Vial dropped to his knees, his hands covering his head, a pathetic whimpering noise escaping his throat. The silver robes soaked up the blood pooling on the floor. The Marines spread out, securing the room, their weapons tracking the corners. They ignored the Overseer entirely. Garrett walked forward. His boots left dirty, bloody footprints on the polished marble. He stopped in front of the desk, looking down at the trembling alien bureaucrat. "The Galactic Accords," Garrett said. His voice was a rasp, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried in the sudden silence of the room. Vial looked up, his lidless black eyes wide with terror. He looked at Garrett, at the grease-stained coveralls, the broken, bleeding hand, the exhausted, hollow face. He recognized the uniform of the indentured lower class. "You," Vial stammered, "you are a laborer. Tell these machines to stop. I can offer credits. I can offer transit passes. Whatever you want." Garrett felt a profound, exhausting emptiness. He had thought facing the man in charge would feel validating. He had thought it would quench the fire in his gut. But looking at Vial, he only saw a pathetic, cowardly bureaucrat who had built a life on the backs of dying species. "I don't want your credits," Garrett said. He leaned heavily against the obsidian desk. "I want to know if you signed the order." Vial blinked, confused. "What order? The station is under my jurisdiction, yes, but—" "Sector 4, Habitation Ring Alpha. 3 hours ago," Garrett interrupted. His voice cracked, but he forced it steady. "Your security forces executed a 9-year-old human girl. They shot her in the chest and dumped her body. Did you sign the pacification order?" Vial stared at him. The confusion deepened, masking the terror for a fraction of a second. "A human? A child?" Vial's mind was racing, trying to calculate the diplomatic angle, trying to find the lie that would save his life. "The automated security grid. It flags contraband technology. Lethal pacification is a standard algorithm for unregistered human-strain biologicals harboring tech. I don't sign individual pest control orders. Pest control. The words hung in the clean, citrus-scented air. Garrett looked away. He looked out the massive window, out at the human fleet that had just murdered tens of thousands of souls. He had triggered a war that would likely consume the galaxy, and the man responsible for the spark didn't even know it had happened. Chloe wasn't a casualty of a grand, evil design. She was a rounding error in an automated algorithm. It was all so incredibly, tragically pointless. She had a blue shoelace, Garrett whispered, mostly to himself. I can change the algorithms, Vile begged, sensing the shift in Garrett's demeanor. He reached out, his long gray fingers brushing Garrett's coveralls. I can grant your people elevated status, complete autonomy within the outer rings. Please, you have to understand. We didn't know you still had this kind of military capacity. It was a clerical error. Garrett looked down at the alien's hand on his suit. He felt no anger anymore, just an overwhelming, crushing fatigue. He looked at the lead Marine. He's all yours, Garrett said, turning his back on the overseer. Wait, no, you can't. The shotgun racked, a heavy, mechanical sound. Garrett walked toward the glass steel window as the weapon fired. He didn't flinch at the sound. He didn't look back as the heavy body slumped to the floor, or as the Marines began systematically smashing the Volary communication consoles with the butts of their rifles. He just pressed his good hand against the cold glass, looking out at the red engines burning in the dark. The silence that fell over the upper levels of Kalen 9 was vastly heavier than the violence that preceded it. It took the UED boarding parties exactly 3 hours to completely pacify the command spire. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't establish holding pens or interrogate the survivors. They swept from deck to deck in absolute terrifying synchronicity, executing anyone wearing the yellow armor of the hegemony or the silver robes of the administration. They ignored the indentured alien species, the Kalen mechanics, the avian transit workers, the countless laborers, leaving them to cower in their cramped quarters amidst the smoking ruins of their former masters. Garrett sat on the edge of the overseer's polished obsidian desk. The bodies of Vale and his guards had been dragged out into the corridor by a pair of silent Marines, leaving wide, smeared trails of deep purple blood drying into a tacky film on the pristine white marble. A combat medic knelt beside Garrett. The soldier wore the same bulky brutalist black armor as the others, but his helmet was retracted, revealing a face pale as milk and heavily lined with the deep, unnatural creases of long-term cryostasis. The medic coughed a wet, rattling sound, his lungs still rejecting 3 centuries of stagnant fluid, while his hands worked with terrifying speed. He didn't speak. He jammed a heavy pneumatic auto-injector into Garrett's neck. A sharp hiss followed, and a cocktail of synthetic painkillers and military-grade stimulants flooded Garrett's bloodstream. The agonizing throb in his broken hand dulled instantly into a distant, numb pressure. The medic slapped a rigid, fast-setting polymer splint over the shattered fingers, pulling the straps tight enough to cut off circulation, and stood up. He gave Garrett a single, curt nod, then walked out of the room. The chemical high left Garrett feeling detached, floating just slightly above his own body. He stared at his boots, at the grease and the alien blood caked into the treads. The heavy timber doors creaked open. The 2 Marines guarding the sanctum instantly snapped to attention. Their heavy boots slammed together, the magnetic locks engaging the deck plates with a sharp crack. Their weapons rested perfectly against their scarred chest plates. A man walked in. He wasn't wearing power armor. He wore the charcoal gray uniform of a United Earth Directorate Fleet Admiral. The uniform was immaculate, pressed to a sharp edge, but the man inside it looked like a corpse dragged from a thawing glacier. Admiral Reed was gaunt. His skin was a translucent, sickly gray, stretched too tight over a sharp jawline and hollow cheekbones. Deep, bruised bags hung beneath eyes that were a startling, icy, bloodshot blue. A network of thin, black cybernetic lines spiderwebbed up the left side of his neck, feeding directly into a metallic implant at the base of his skull. He walked with a heavy cane made of brushed steel, his left leg dragging slightly with every step, the servos in his knee brace whining in protest. 300 years of the long sleep hadn't preserved him. It had simply stretched his dying across centuries. Reed stopped in the center of the room, leaning his weight heavily onto the cane. He slowly surveyed the shattered communication consoles, the bullet holes chewing up the imported marble walls, and finally the exhausted mechanic sitting on the desk. "Chief Warrant Officer Hayes," Reed said. His voice was a dry, crackling sound, like dead leaves being crushed under a heavy boot. It lacked the synthetic modulation of the comms, revealing a deep, rasping fatigue. Garrett didn't stand at attention. He couldn't. His knees felt like water. He just nodded slowly. "Admiral." Reed limped forward, stopping a few feet from Garrett. He turned his head, looking out the massive, spider-webbed glass steel window at the fleet holding position in the expanding debris field. "The core fusion drives are failing on half our dreadnoughts," Reed stated. His tone was entirely conversational, devoid of the righteous fanaticism Garrett had expected from a resurrected commander. "The cryopods malfunctioned on the Vanguard, the Aegis, and the Cromwell. Over 80,000 men and women reduced to biological soup because a few cheap synthetic rubber seals dry rotted in the dark." He turned his pale, icy eyes back to Garrett. "We aren't a conquering army, Hayes. We are a ghost ship taking on water. We have enough heavy ordnance to burn a dozen sectors, and then our reactors are going to stall. We are going to starve, and we are going to die in the cold." Garrett looked down at his splinted hand, flexing the numb, trapped fingers. "Then why did you answer the call?" Reed let out a slow, rattling breath. He reached into his immaculate uniform pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out a dented silver flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a small sip, and grimaced as the harsh ethanol hit his ruined throat. "Because we swore an oath to protect Earth," Reed said softly, staring at the flask. "And Earth is a cinder. We swore to protect humanity, but humanity surrendered, scattered into the dirt, and let themselves be collared by alien bureaucrats for a ration of nutrient paste." Reed gestured with the flask toward the tacky, drying blood on the floor. "We woke up choking on dust in a galaxy that forgot we existed. We had no home to return to, no civilians to protect, and no high command to issue orders. We had no purpose, Hayes, until a runaway engineer down in the filth decided that a single dead child was worth burning the galaxy down." Reed capped the flask and slipped it away. "You didn't break protocol. You gave us a war. You gave ghosts a target to haunt." Garrett felt a cold, heavy knot tighten in his chest. He thought of the Valeri merchants, the Kalan mechanics caught in the crossfire, the total, indiscriminate slaughter that had secured this room. "I didn't want a galactic war. I just wanted them to acknowledge her. I wanted the man who signed the order to see that she mattered. They see it now, Reed said coldly, and so will the rest of the hegemony when they find the pieces of this station. He turned heavily toward the door, his cane clicking against the marble. We are seizing the station's lower dry docks. We need mechanics to patch the fleet's containment systems before the Volari Corps Armada responds to the distress beacons. I expect you in Hangar Bay 4 in 2 hours, Chief. I deserted, Admiral, Garrett said. His voice was hollow, scraping the bottom of his throat. I walked away from the Directorate 20 years ago. Reed stopped at the broken threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. The icy blue eyes were entirely devoid of pity. Nobody walks away, Hayes. You proved that today. You can hide in the dirt, you can fix their pipes, and you can pretend you're just a rat surviving in the walls. But when they push you far enough, you bare your teeth and bite just like the rest of us. The Admiral stepped out into the corridor. The 2 Marines fell in perfectly behind him, their heavy boots fading down the hall in a rhythmic, merciless cadence. Garrett was left alone in the ruins of the Overseer's sanctum. He sat there for a long time, listening to the silent hum of the Volari air scrubbers failing to filter out the smell of burnt copper and death. He stood up slowly. His joints ached with a deep, grinding pain. His head pounded in time with his heartbeat. He walked over to the massive glass steel window and looked out at the vast, uncaring void. The stars were cold, distant pinpricks of light, completely obscured by the massive, brutalist silhouettes of the human fleet. He reached into the pocket of his greasy coveralls with his good hand. He didn't have the blue wire anymore. It was gone, incinerated to dust, sacrificed to open a door so monsters could do their bloody work. But he could still feel the phantom texture of it against his thumb. He could still see the gap in Chloe's teeth when she smiled, smelling of stolen synth apples and ozone. Garrett leaned his forehead against the cold glass. He wasn't a hero. He was just a tired, broken mechanic who had finally run out of places to hide. He had traded the quiet, suffocating cruelty of the Volari for the loud, apocalyptic vengeance of his own kind. He looked at the nearest dreadnought, its hull scarred, unpainted, and ugly. He let out a long, ragged sigh, his breath fogging the glass. 2 hours, he whispered to the empty room. He turned his back on the stars, stepping over the drying blood of his former masters, and began the long walk down to the hangar bays. The ghosts were waiting, and they had a lot of work to do. If you felt the cold vacuum of space and the raw, unyielding vengeance of Earth's hidden fleet, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to honor the fallen. Share this with your fellow sci-fi fans who love a dark, gritty HFY tale, and subscribe to the channel for more epic, grounded stories from the edges of the galaxy. Drop a comment below. Did Garrett make the right choice waking the fleet? Or did he just trade one monster for another? Sound off, and we'll see you in the next transmission.